Thanks, Bill, for the kind introduction and a very nice welcome today to this talk. A confession right up front, I'm an economist, but I also studied American literature and mathematics. So it's not only economists here, and I hope you bear with us. IIASA's ambition is to contain and reduce the impacts of global public bads. And we heard about this a lot over the last few days. Two global public bads are natural disasters and climate change, and they are really interlinked. In my talk, I want to discuss how we can produce useful information to reduce the impacts of disasters and impacts from climate change. And particularly, I want to emphasize that it's important to think about vulnerability, so the susceptibility of people, agents, countries, communities to extreme events, and how we can better take this into account. So this is pretty much in line with what Bill produced. Let me go right into the talk. Start with the big picture. Recently, the IPCC produced a special report on extreme events. It came out earlier this year, and the IIASA staff contributed to that report. A key message that we, to some extent, knew was that the impacts from disasters have increased over the last few years in terms of events, also in terms of losses. Last year marked the year with the highest losses ever, so close to $400 billion in losses. There were more than 800 events. There's also bright part to it, of course. Last year, still a lot of people were killed, but much less than in previous years. So in terms of loss of life, we're seeing a decrease over time. What we didn't know as much, and this was particularly brought out in the report, was that climate change adds to the picture. Climate change does not only increase temperature, increases sea level, but unfortunately, it also increases the intensity, frequency, and duration of extreme events. So that's bad news. At the same time, natural disasters are, to some extent, natural, but to a large extent, they are unnatural. So natural disasters are driven by hazard and changes therein, but importantly, by people and assets. We heard about Bill. Counting the people and assets is an important part of that. Today, I will be talking about the vulnerability, so susceptibility of people, agents, etc., to certain events and how to take this into account. Why is vulnerability important? Here, a quick example. In 2008, normal temperature or normal temperature-related phenomenon, seasonal rainfalls in Zimbabwe, coupled with high institutional and socio-economic vulnerability, caused the largest ever recorded outbreak of cholera in Africa, with more than 4,000 people dead and more than 90,000 affected. How should analysts and IIASA and, of course, our partners and other scientists think about analyzing the risks emanating from disasters and climate change? To a large extent, the field over the last years has been climate-driven, one could say, so informed by climate science first, and then vulnerability and exposure and risk come into the picture only later. To some extent, that's useful. To some extent, I'm arguing in this talk, and this is, of course, this is one argumentation. There's other truths to that. But to some extent, vulnerability-driven analysis can also be useful, I would say. Why is this so? Well, first and foremost, projections of natural hazards are by definition associated with large uncertainties. We're talking about extreme events. There's very little observations. So we have little to rely on our statistics and modeling on. Climate change is a long-term phenomenon. It's associated with lots of uncertainties, as we know. At the same time, we have a problem now. We have an adaptation deficit today. So there is actually information on today's vulnerabilities and exposure. And these may be useful starting points to think about disaster risk management today and in the future. Of course, we are producing, as we assess those and manage those better, those vulnerabilities of today, we are creating benefits today, and we are laying the foundations for creating more benefits in the future. So to some extent, this is also coming from the IPCC report. To some extent, we are suggesting, and others, a set of scientists are suggesting, let's think about vulnerability and exposure at the right scale of risk management as a first starting point, then couple this with climate modeling, meteorological modeling, weather modeling, to think about global, regional, and information at the right scale of risk management, and couple this with options for better managing risks and better adapting to the changing climate. And we heard today also from our Pakistani NMO that we live in a wetter world to some extent. At the same time, we also live in a drier world, which is a bit contradictory, but that's basically what we can expect. Extremes are changing in the future, and we need to think about taking action forward. What are gaps and priorities when you think about vulnerability and research? I think lots of you will know that vulnerability is quite a fuzzy concept. I'm sure I just presented one definition. There's 30 other definitions. It's rather fuzzy. So how to think about it, how to quantify it, and how to integrate it. That's also what's, of course, IIASA business, how to think about integrated approach. Linking to an estimate of risk is very important. Nobody manages vulnerability. There's no vulnerability managers out there. There's risk managers. Risk is somewhat well understood, and we see also there's major challenges to it, as we've seen in the financial crisis. A key gap, and this is what I'm addressing in my talk, is actually there's lack of useful information on differential vulnerability. So people are different in different places, and we need to understand how people are different in those different places. People could be farmers, could be households. People, well, collection of people as governments, and of course the global community. Another important point is we also interested in understanding the longer-term effect of risk of events on people. So what does it mean in terms of income, poverty, debt, also education, of course. Right, let me put things into a conceptual framework. I talked about hazard exposure and physical and environmental vulnerability. And these are shaped, these drivers or these elements of risk are shaped by climate and weather, but also by socio-economic factors. And that's why we economists are sitting here. So one could put this together to an estimate of the direct impact: loss of life, loss of assets, what you see in the news always. So these are key impacts that are recorded. What is less well recorded, and this is the heart of our business, is to think about the socio-economic vulnerability, the ability to cope or the inability to cope with events, and think about the indirect impacts on poverty, debt, income, and probably also education, which I didn't put up here. So we are doing work on macro level scales to think about governments, countries, the global community's ability to deal with extremes. Importantly, over the last few years, we have also looked at micro scales, and here we're trying to understand better the interplay of extremes, risk and poverty. And a key concern here is, of course, the vulnerability of subsistence farmers in lots of places in the world, including Asia and Africa, so the vulnerability of those farmers to drought as a key risk factor. We're not doing this for scientific interest only, but also we hope we can inform thinking on implementation of mechanisms to lift farmers out of poverty. So that was rather general. Let me now highlight what I said with two studies, or results from two studies we've done. One focus of our work is on India. We've done work in northern India and the state of Uttar Pradesh, the largest state in India, as the Indian colleagues sitting in the audience will know, 200 million people, lots of those subsistence farmers. Here the question is actually, how do disasters, extreme events, how do they affect livelihoods of subsistence farmers? Recently we did a survey in 2 villages with more than 200 observations. And this was a large-scale survey, taking lots of time. Importantly, it wasn't really done by us. It was done with colleagues in the field. And this is, I guess, also a very important point for IIASA, which is like a research think tank operating out of Vienna. We are doing work in the field with NGOs and research organizations. And here we had some from Nepal and from India that actually did this surveys, because my Hindi is really limited, and so it's actually non-existent. So it's difficult. We need people in the field to do the work with us, actually. What emerged from that study? In this chart here, you see on the left side, you see actually the impacts in terms of loss of income. If you look at state-level statistics, the impacts from 3 recent disaster events in the state of Uttar Pradesh. We see those impacts overall in this large state. Actually, they are rather marginal. In our survey, where we of course look into more exposed population, more exposed farmers, we're seeing that then impacts actually a magnitude higher. And for certain events, a drought event, a drought shock, or a flood event can eat up more than 60% of that income in a given year. So that's very important. Looking at the differential vulnerability and risk, you find out actually those effects are much more pronounced than if you just look at the statistics. Because the key take-home message, if I may say so, is, of course, disaster risk is pretty much unrecorded. Nobody records this well. So doing surveys and samples is useful. Key question is, of course, given this direct impact, this direct shock, what can be done? What are coping mechanisms? And here's a pie chart with a number of coping mechanisms. Let me just highlight 2. So going to money lenders is a quite common strategy in India and other places. But also there's family and friends. Also there's a informal strategy. Go to your family and friends, and they will also help you out to some extent in the aftermath of events. So that just highlights that access. Here in this study, we found out that access to economic and social capital, if I may say so. We're economists again, talking about capital in a wider sense, and I hope you understand us. So money lenders is, of course, economic capital. Kinship arrangement would be social capital, how to build this fabric that sustains our way of life. So we did the survey, but also we did the survey to think about the modeling the indirect effects emanating from disaster. So basically, we have some ideas about socio-economic vulnerability. And now the question was, what's the weather like and how does it play out over time? In this chart, you see a rainfall organized around 10-day growing periods. And you see the greenish line, the sustained line, and basically it's today's rainfall. And then we see projections for 2030 and 50. And what we're seeing actually, that with climate change, there's more and less rainfall. There's more rainfall early on in the monsoon, the rainfall period, and there's less rainfall later on. And particularly the less rainfall later on during harvesting or before harvesting, during the final growing season, is very important. This creates drought shocks. So there's an increased risk of drought shocks happening. So we took this forward, so this idea of social vulnerability, socio-economic vulnerability, coupling with weather information, to think about basically what does a certain drought event means. And here you see a really simple simulation where we looked into one farming household, one typical farming household that is just below the poverty line in that study period. We thought we modeled this household without a drought event happening. And of course here there's a good message. This household would be able over time to accumulate capital, invest in better handling agriculture, and over time be able to escape the poverty line. With a drought actually happening, we see that a household would lose income in a certain year, but over time income would stagnate. Why would income stagnate? The household would actually accumulate debt, because households look to money lenders. They would accumulate debt over time. They need to repay debt. So this constrains households in coming out of poverty. So that's one message here. In the study that I'm not reporting further on, actually, we also looked into certain options for helping actually households contain the effects of risk. And here, basically, community-based non-support microinsurance is quite useful. Let me only quickly highlight the second study we've done in Uganda. Here we teamed up with the London School of Economics and the Greenman Foundation. And we worked with knowledge workers using smartphones, like you all have some. And the question was, apart from economic factors, what are other factors shaping vulnerability and coping? Here again, a pie chart, lots of options. Actually, the money lending didn't come out at all. It wasn't really an option here, but selling livestock was a key option. And an important one I wanted to contrast with that one was taking your kids out of school. Why do I highlight this option that was only mentioned 1% by people? It's an option that creates irreversibilities. Taking your kids out of school creates long-term effects in terms of loss of educational attainment. And I'm also part of the population session here, so that's an important aspect to highlight. Quickly, what is determining, in the remaining time, what is determining actually the uptake of those coping strategies? If you look at livestock as selling as an option, here click only economic. Well, mainly economic determinants were quite important. So the availability of a crop surplus and having a large share of income derived from farming reduced the odds of selling livestock. So this was a Probit regression, which has a probabilistic characteristic to it. The other option, the formal education, here very importantly actually, what is important here? Here really it was human capital. Here we found out that a better educated household head would be less likely to take the kids out of school as a way of coping with events. So that's really interesting because that points towards benefits of investing into human capital in certain ways. Quickly, my conclusions as I need to wrap up. What I started with saying extreme events are important, they exert a heavy toll. IIASA is actually trying to understand what that toll means on a micro level also, and how does differential vulnerability and risk play out. And I try to inform you about dominant coping strategies and what are shaping those. Here we have human and social capital play a key role. And overall, I suggested, well, it's important to understand those vulnerabilities and exposure aspects in addition to climate issues, to think about useful way forward to inform better risk management and climate adaptation. With that, I thank you for your attention.